when I worked in the legislature? Yes, you weren't yet in the Senate when I worked there when we first met. So excited to have you here. Grateful for you being here.
Certainly.
Yeah, and then we have Delegate Marcia Price from the Hampton Roads region. Welcome, Delegate Price. And Delegate Marcus Simon, also from Northern Virginia, and he's in there as well. So I would suggest for everyone to set your Zoom to speaker view as opposed to the gallery view. It's in the upper right-hand corner above all the photos. That way, whoever's speaking, you will see as opposed to 50 people. But that's your choice. If you like it the other way, you can do it however you like, but I just find that easier so you can kind of zoom in to see who is actually speaking when we're going on. We're going to collect, if you have any issues, just use the chat feature, and Teresa or I or Delegate Toscano will kind of see that, and we'll try to help you out. That's also where we'll ask you when we start taking questions to put your questions in and go from there. So any quick announcements or other things that people have questions on before I introduce our esteemed moderator?
Hey, Stephen.
Yes.
Hey, it's Chris Burton. I just wanted to say real quick, we had a great socially distanced in-person phone bank last night with the Charlottesville Dems, which was amazing. Thanks to Nancy O'Brien for hosting that. And yeah, please check out our weekend of action this weekend for Vice President Biden, Senator Warner, and Dr. Webb.
Great. Thanks. And that's Chris Burton, who's our local organizer with the coordinated campaign. So you can chat him if you want to get connected to the coordinated campaign. So great. Well, we're thrilled to have our now retired delegate and former Democratic leader, David Toscano, to moderate this forum. David's been around this issue for his entire career, I think probably in the legislature. So we're glad that he was willing to take some time out today and moderate this panel for us. So Delegate Toscano, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you everybody for being involved in putting this together, and all the participants for being willing to lend their knowledge to something that may be one of the most consequential votes that Virginians take in the last decade, over the last decade. You know, good policy making is all about getting into the weeds, and boy, there are a lot of weeds involved in this one. It is a very complex issue, and I'm assuming that many people on the call today have a pretty clear knowledge of how this redistricting amendment works in terms of process. But because there may be some people who don't know, we're going to come back to this issue again and again. For those of you who don't know, this is a constitutional amendment. It is not a statute. And under Virginia law, the way you add something to the Constitution is that the language of the resolution has to be passed in the same form with the same words for 2 consecutive legislative sessions separated by an election. And if that happens, the amendment goes on the ballot for voters to vote on. If they approve it, it goes into the Constitution. But that's not the end of the game, as our panelists will tell us. There will be statutory language that needs to be passed also by the General Assembly that implements the terms of the constitutional amendment. And unless I'm mistaken, I don't think they did that in the last session, and probably will have to do that. So with that in mind, we're going to turn it over to our panelists. And I believe we're going to start with Professor Green from William and Mary, who's done a lot of work in the area of redistricting reform. I think she's going to make a case for why the amendment should be supported by the voters. She's done a lot of work about transparency in redistricting, which is a really interesting issue, and we'll probably get into some of that as we go along. So Professor Green, are you ready? If so, take it away.
I am ready. First, let me say thank you to the organizers of this event. This is critically important that voters be educated about the trade-offs and the historic nature of this amendment, so I'm thrilled to be here. I've been teaching election law at William and Mary for over 10 years, and for the past few years, I've also been teaching a class in which students learn to use computer software to draw Virginia House maps. In fact, Delegate Price was a guest lecturer in our class a few years ago, which was a great honor. Every year I reread cases for class and I'm amazed afresh by how contorted this area of law is. It's so confusing. And this is part of the reason that in the past, abuses of the process have piled up. It's very easy for self-interested legislators to pull a fast one. So I'm here to lay out some of this law. I'm not here to present a political view. I'm hoping I can be a resource in this discussion. I'm going to talk about two aspects of this question in front of us, in front of voters. The first is transparency, and the second is a little bit about the Voting Rights Act and its implications on this decision. So first, transparency. I've written in the past about redistricting transparency, and my project this summer is to take that up again with a slightly different frame that I thought would be useful to present some of my findings here. So in 2012, the Center for Public Integrity graded each state's redistricting process for its degree of transparency. It actually gave each state a grade, a letter grade, A through F, on whether or not its process was transparent. It looked at whether line drawers held open meetings, whether they made redistricting information and data available to the public, whether they meaningfully considered public input, whether the maps were presented in time for public comment and revision. And answers to these questions earned states letter grades. I know you're all dying to know, Virginia got a C, which is obviously not good. The second variable I examined in this project is the number of months in litigation that each state has endured since the last redistricting round. I had 5 students comb through all the litigation in the last decade and count in months the number of months that states endured. Virginia did not do well on this either. I don't have to tell you, with a total of 97 months in litigation. And my question is simple. Did a higher transparency grade translate into less litigation? And the short answer from what I found is that yes, it did. The 28 states that received a C through an F grade in the CPI report spent an average of 45 months litigating their state or congressional lines. The 22 states, that was 45 months for the states that had poor transparency processes. The 22 states that received a CPI grade of A through B minus spent an average of only 18 months in litigation. So that's quite a dramatic difference. States with high CPI grades thus experience roughly 1/3 of the amount of litigation that states with poor transparency grades averaged. And I think this finding is significant. It confirms what's intuitively true. When the process is fair and there is public buy-in and line drawers have not endeavored to pull the wool over anyone's eyes, the maps are likely to be fair, and fair processes, fair maps, draw less litigation. When the process is secretive, it's more likely that something fishy is going on and that the product is more likely to draw litigation. No better poster child for this is Wisconsin, where Republicans shut Democrats and the public out of the process, and even made Republican legislators who entered the hotel room where the maps were being drawn, they made them sign confidentiality agreements. And of course, Wisconsin's maps, suffice it to say, saw a lot of litigation, including at the Supreme Court. Interestingly, there were several outliers, and 2 of the biggest are Florida and Arizona, which both earned an A from the CPI, but both, as you may know, experienced quite a lot of litigation. I thought I'd just quickly talk about each because I think it's interesting and relevant to our discussion today. So Florida's process produced wildly unfair maps, even though they got an A from the CPI report. In Florida, there were approximately 41% Democrats versus 36% Republicans, and yet the maps produced classically lopsided results. A 12 to 28 split in the Senate in favor of Republicans, and the Democrats won just 10 out of Florida's 27 congressional seats. And so you might say that litigation in those circumstances was going to flow no matter what. But what was so striking about the Florida litigation is that it revealed that the process transparency was in name only. The Center for Public Integrity had been duped in awarding an A grade. In fact, Republican operatives had posed as disinterested members of the public and presented maps and comments through public portals. The legislature held public meetings, but legislators had hired political consultants who were working up maps in the back room. So Florida's approach to redistricting form is very different than what Virginia has on the table. Instead of establishing a commission and requiring that work be transparent, Florida instead passed an amendment to its constitution prohibiting its legislators from considering partisanship in the process, which is sort of like asking a zebra not to have stripes. And sure enough, trickery entered the scene. It was lip service transparency only. And I think that's a big reason why the process produced such unfair maps. Arizona is another example of a state that earned an A from the CPI report, but experienced a tidal wave of litigation. And I think what happened in Arizona is that the political winds were so toxic and opponents to reform were so litigious that litigation was unavoidable. We're seeing something similar shaping up in Michigan. You may be wondering whether all states that try redistricting reform are doomed to months and months of litigation, particularly as you consider this amendment. But it's not necessarily the case. California is a great example of a state in which voters passed meaningful reform and in which litigation was minimal. Only 3 months of litigation of the California lines. California, of course, installed in the last round a redistricting commission. A huge reason is that California's process was wildly transparent. Everyone who wanted to say got one. The commission did its work in full public view, made its data public. It was really, quite a shining example of transparency. And I will tell you that when you read the very few opinions that did emerge in litigation on the California lines that came out, the court opinions that did issue credited the process as being fair and deferred to the commission because it had been fair and transparent. So Virginia got a poor transparency grade, as I mentioned, and saw lots of litigation, as we all know. And I think a huge part of the litigation stemmed from the type of the process that Virginia used in 2010. Legislators wheeled and dealed to protect incumbents and reduce competition. It was a classic bipartisan gerrymander. And the result was contorted districts where political favors jumped off the page. The result was also, as several courts recognized, unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. The point of my going into this in so much detail is that think what you may about various aspects of the proposed amendment, but to me, the single most important guarantee is transparency protections being enshrined in Virginia's constitution, something that very few states in this country can boast. The constitutional protection for transparency will ensure that Virginians can closely monitor the process and that they can play a meaningful role in the development of the maps. And I think this is a huge step forward. A vote no leaves the transparency question unguarded and without constitutional force. I thought I would spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about the voting rights aspect of this, sort of transferring over from the transparency discussion. So I don't want to bore anyone.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure, please.
Because I want to make sure that we give some folks on the other part of the side here an opportunity to speak. How long is your voting rights thing going to go, and can it wait for
I would be happy to turn over the floor.
Okay, because I want to talk about the Voting Rights Act, and I think Cia Price, who I wanted to call next,
wonderful,
is in a good position to talk about this a little bit, and then we're going to circle around to this because this is really important to understand in terms of the litigation issues involving this. So, Cia, are you in a position to talk a little bit about what some of your concerns are about the amendment, and then we'll come back?
Yeah, thank you, David. And I will start with saying that this might be set up as a debate, but I wholeheartedly agree with everything, if I may call you Rebecca, Rebecca said. So this may not be as contentious as people are hoping for. So I hope your bagels are good, because I'm not sure this is going to be the bloodbath that some people had hoped for.
I feel the same way, Cia.
Yeah. But honestly, so when I put forward House Bill 1256, which was originally a legislative fix that was an all-independent commission, we actually had even a little bit more transparency mechanisms in it than the enabling legislation had, as was originally presented. And when Barker and Van Valkenburg and I and Luke and Lucas and Laka and all of us got together, that is one thing that we absolutely agreed on. And so I don't want this to be some like false dichotomy in all the pieces, but there are some key pieces where I think we differ. So I just want to be very transparent myself about how I approach this. One is that I don't have the luxury of just thinking about 2021 redistricting process when I approach this conversation. And I think that's what Toscano was alluding to when I'm talking about these things. I have 2031, 2041, 2051 in mind because we're talking about the Constitution. And I don't have the hope that some of the things that I see wrong with the amendment that will have that same energy that we have to pass the amendment in order to fix the amendment. And that's why I'm so hoping that we actually get the amendment right the first time. I think the majority, I think the research that both sides are working from think that a independent commission is the best way to go. And that is why I am personally a no vote on this, along with some other things. And so a no vote in this conversation does not equate wanting to keep things status quo. I am the sponsor of House Bill 1255, which got us to the place now where after July 1st, racial, political, and prison gerrymandering are now illegal in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I just do want to pause and let everybody know that is major. So I think we can all agree that we have gotten to a major mark here as we're hoping to move forward. And I put up that criteria legislation for 4 years before it passed. But the third thing about me is that I usually like to meet with audiences and get to know them prior to speaking. So I'm a little nervous, but I am going to jump right head into race relations. And that is, I think, a lot of what the conversation for me has been about. So if I am wrong in the assumption that you all are ready to have this conversation, then I think we'll all learn something together today. But the way the conversation even happened since the last few moments of the 2019 session, when a few members of the House that were members of the Legislative Black Caucus got up to speak out against the first vote for the amendment. When the conference report was being written, there were no people of color at the table, and there was only one woman who was a Republican. And so I think that is the ultimate demonstration of one of the things that I have wrong with this, where it does not guarantee that there will be racial diversity at the table when these things are being drawn. And I think in 2020, that is just not moving us in the right direction. The Black legislators, when we spoke up about our issues, we were often met with from 2019 and even today that our issues could be handled later. And that is historically what has been told to a lot of people who on civil rights issues, that, you know, we've got to get the larger reform, but we'll get to your issues later. And I think that one of the saddest moments for me this month has been the fact that Congressman John Lewis passed without the voting rights having been reauthorized. And that was the main thing he had been fighting for since he was 17. Outspoken members of the VLBC ourselves have been attacked racially and gender. My intelligence has been questioned. My motives have been questioned. And this race and gender-based condescension has been what has actually shrouded the racial parts of this conversation, as if to say, well, I may be Black, but I don't really know about the Voting Rights Act. And that was nobody on this call, but from some of the proponents that have been speaking in private meetings that didn't know that they were being recorded. The last thing that I'll say about how this conversation has been going is that if you've asked yourself, well, how can it be that 4 Black legislators are for it, but 17 are against it, that is the wrong framework. That is assuming that Black people are a monolith and that we have to agree on everything. Something can be bad for Black people and not all Black people agree on why it's bad. So I just want to put that out. That is my transparent moment for how I am coming into these conversations. And the parts that I wanted to bring to the forefront about the Voting Rights Act, I actually want to quote Senator Barker on some of this from the committee meeting on March 6th, when I asked if, you know, the protections, we've gotten fancy flyers and they're all really pretty, if the protections for the Voting Rights Act and for voting rights are baked into the amendment. That's the language that's been being used. The actual protections are in the amendment. I asked him if he could show me where, and he answered, actually, a lot of what I referenced was in what we've been working on this session in terms of enactment legislation, which he was talking about Senate Bill 203. So I said, you know, based on the communication I'm hearing from advocates, it said it's enshrined. Do you agree with that? And if you agree with that, where is it? And he points to lines 23 to 32. And that references federal and state laws, the 14th Amendment, the equal protection of the 14th Amendment, the United States Constitution, and the Voting Rights Act. But a very important part of this conversation is that when I asked if the Voting Rights Act were further gutted on the federal level, would the protections that we think we have today be in the actual constitutional amendment? And his answer was, what this states is that the provisions of the VRA of 1965 as amended, so if it were thrown out by the court, it would be incumbent upon us to try to do something to address this issue, since there would then be a gap in terms of the things that we are providing these protections. I do certainly recognize the legitimacy of your concerns as it relates to some of the actions that have already been taken by the Supreme Court, the failure of Congress to update the standards of the VRA, which should have been done decades ago. And so I think what we need to do is be vigilant on that type of thing and make sure that we have provisions in our code to be able to address some of these types of issues throughout the process, and that we are highly responsive. Should there be something that further weakens the VRA? And so here's the biggest conundrum. When I have brought these concerns for the protections for racial minorities, we are not in a post-racial society. We have seen race-based voter suppression happening. Now, Virginia, we are not as blatant as Florida or Georgia, but it's happening. Photo ID, all of the things that the Democrats worked so hard to roll back this year, that was voter suppression. And so the idea that we would be able to protect communities of color in a piece of legislation, but when Marcus Simon and I put together a piece of legislation, we were told that legislation wasn't enough. And so if you're going to say legislation is not enough to form the commission, but legislation is enough to handle the concerns of communities of color, then I will point out to you that the bill that got us to anti-gerrymandering language this year passed on a party line vote. So while it may be in place for 2021, and while a lot of people may just be worried about 2021, if the Democrats should lose power, the first thing to go is going to be the bills that the Republicans already told you today that they don't agree with. And that is where the voting protection language actually is. And that was either in the enabling legislation or in House Bill 1255. And so there are 5 lines, and there are 5 things that are referenced to that are supposed to give me enough confidence that the state or Commonwealth of Virginia will have our best interests at heart, while also no requirements that there is racial diversity at the table that's actually talking about this. And just one last thing, because I'm sure we'll get into more discussion about this, is just, it is interesting to me when we come to a moral argument about whether or not what is in the amendment is enough. If you look at the words in the amendment and you look at any 2 pairings of Republicans, whether it be Gilbert and Bell, Norman and Stanley, forgive me if I don't have confidence that either of those 2 pairings have my best interest at heart. That is just not enough. And the fact that either of those 2 could be at a table, or any of their cohorts could be at a table, when for 20 years they have been passing and supporting legislation to suppress the vote of people that look like me, that my 101-year-old grandmother voted in a fair district in 2019 because the courts interceded based on racial gerrymanders. I think that it proves that we need stronger language within that amendment in order to protect us for years to come.
Thank you, Delegate Price. And it's actually a perfect segue to Senator Barker. And again, I think one of the things that Delegate Price emphasized, and we have to keep in mind, is that the passage of the amendment or its failure, the passage of the amendment still requires some additional action by the General Assembly, not only for this redistricting, but for the redistricting in 2031 or any other time we do redistricting. So, Senator Barker, would you like to take it from here? And you guys have been great in teeing up these issues. There are people who are posting on the chat the actual language of the amendment, which I think is really interesting because it does use that language, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which essentially has been decimated by the Republicans in the Congress. So Senator Barker, you want to take over from here?
Certainly, I'd be happy to, Delegate Toscano. Good to see you again today. And certainly happy to be on here with my with Professor Green and with my friends Delegate Price and Delegate Simon. I'm glad we can have a frank discussion on things and really without making it personal, and be able to address the issues here and give people information to help them make decisions as to what they do in November when they're voting, whether to vote in favor of or opposed to the amendment. We did have a process set up, and what Delegate Price referred to was specifically the constitutional amendment, but also there was a process that she and I participated in early in the legislative session this year, where we had 7 Democratic legislators who developed the criteria bill, the language bill for what would be shown on the amendment on the screen with the amendment when you vote on it, and also with enabling legislation. And we worked, I think, twice a week, late into the night for the first several weeks of the session to be able to get it right. And I think we came up with very good proposals there for all 3 of those. So I think that there are things that can help address these issues. Delegate Price is right in that the language that is in the constitutional amendment is broader and more broadly encompassing on things, but does not have all the detail that was incorporated within the criteria bill that passed this year. And as she said, that passed on basically a party line vote. That was party line, partly because I think less because of some of the issues related to race, but more because of political nature. There were things Republicans would have liked to have had in there, and that they had put in bills that they had passed in previous years, only to have them vetoed by Governor Northam, so that that would have in effect favored them in the drawing of the districts. And so we were able to not get those pieces in there. I think there are significant issues that everybody needs to take into consideration as you're looking at things here. There are sort of 3 broad issues that have been raised by those who have concerns about this. And this is, the issues are the issues that Delegate Price was just raising in terms of racial and ethnic fairness and the ability to be able to control outcomes, to elect candidates of their choice, which is critical here and has been successful to a certain extent in Virginia. And then also, secondly, second significant issue is the issue of involvement of legislators on the commission. That is a point of discussion here. And the third is the role of the Supreme Court and the courts in acting on these things. So there are a lot, some significant issues that do need to be addressed. And what we did, I think we came up with a very good set. And actually, 4 of the 7 legislators that we had on this ad hoc committee that were developing these bills are African American. Senators Locke, Lucas, and McClellan, in addition to Delegate Price. So I think we had direct input, obviously, in the process here to come up with good language. The question is whether we can get that good language not only in the criteria bill and the legislation that we have and what's in the code, but also get it into the Constitution. And I'm certainly would be happy to work with Delegate Price and others if the constitutional amendment passes this year, to get those elements that are not in the, that are related, they're covered in the criteria bill that was Jennifer McClellan's this year that passed into the constitutional amendment starting in the 2021 session, which would be when we could be able to bring that forward and hopefully have it voted on by the voters in the November of 2022. So I think there are opportunities to address that issue. It's just that we were not in a position in 2019 to be able to incorporate all that detail with the Republicans opposing it across the board when they had the majorities in both the House and the Senate. So I think it's important to address this issue. This is a critical issue, one that's important to all of us, and that we need to continue to work to make sure that we provide as much in the way as we can in terms of the protections that are there. This year, what we did have, and Delegate Price worked very hard with us on issues for the bills that we put in, but made clear all along that she was opposed to the constitutional amendment. So, you know, she was not hiding that in any sense of the imagination there. And Delegate Price, if I could find out who was questioning your intelligence, I can give him a good talking to on things. So, you know, that's certainly not an issue here. So, but there are two other things that I want to touch on briefly before we get to all the questions and everything. One is the role of legislators. You know, what some people have clearly pushed for is to have a commission that would be strictly a citizen commission. I think that actually there is advantage to having what we have in this amendment of having 8 of the 16 members being legislators, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and 8 of the citizen of the commission, 16 commission members being citizens who are there. And what we build in is that to pass anything, any plans, you have to have 6 of the 8 legislators and 6 of the 8 citizens vote for it, so that neither side can control the process and dictate to the other side what the final outcome is going to be, even if they were to be able to get just 1 or 2 people on the other side, or the other category there. And I think one of the things that is important is that if we had had a citizen commission in 2011 and it had operated under some of the criteria that have been proposed by some of the various citizen groups at different times, there is a very good chance that in a state that since 2010 has voted Democratic for every statewide office, we would have had districts that would have favored Republicans because they likely would have done things, maybe in many instances unknowingly, that would have resulted in the majority of the districts being Republican leaning. In the Senate, what we most likely would have had would have been either 24 or 25 of the 40 seats being Republican leaning, and only 15 or 16 of the districts being Democratic leaning, even though this is a Democratic leaning state overall. So I think that there are advantages to having the legislators involved who understand some of the, and are going to make sure that they are protecting their issues, you know, their party there. And what we have now is that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans can have the districts dictated to them. They have to agree, and it has to be a balanced thing to get you there. The third major issue that has come up in the discussions that have been boiling up on things has been the role of the courts in the process. Actually, one of the senators after the 2019 session did have his staff check how these issues are dealt with in other states. And what they determined was that every single state in the country, it's the state Supreme Court who has the final authority on any appeals or any challenges to the districts that have been drawn. There are federal courts that are involved, and that's how we got changes to both the House of Delegates and the congressional districts in Virginia. 2 of the 3 maps that were drawn, the 2 that were drawn by Republicans, both got thrown out because of racial gerrymandering. The one that was in the Senate that was drawn basically by Democrats, although we did have to work with Republicans to some extent on things to be able to get the governor to sign it. That map was challenged, but withstood the challenge and had no problems there. So, you know, we at least did the right thing in terms of how we handled things, whereas the Republicans did not in the House of Delegates and congressional districts. The issue beyond that is that we now have criteria. One of the other issues is that we now have criteria and the Supreme Court would have to take that criteria into consideration if things were challenged and taken to the Supreme Court. We also have a situation whereby in the legislation that Delegate Price and I and the others developed on the enabling legislation, which as Delegate Toscano has referenced, did not in the end pass. It got passed in both the House and the Senate with almost identical language. One word was added in the House and 3 words in that same part of it, 1 sentence were taken out. So that, there are, there was very little difference in terms of that perspective. It's just that when it went to conference committee, Delegate Price and Delegate Simon were on the conference committee and did not want to accept either the House language or the Senate language on that. So it did not get passed during the legislative session. And we will come back and take care of that, I think, pretty quickly after the action taken by the voters in November. One of the things is that the criteria don't favor either party there. However, a substitute that was proposed by Delegate Simon would actually involve potentially the bills going, the language, if the commission did not, independent commission did not pick a plan of 1 or 2 plans going back to the General Assembly. And if you had a Republican controlled General Assembly, all you have to do is have a Republican plan being considered by the commission, and the Republican General Assembly then could enact it and actually have a partisan gerrymander there. In addition, what you also have is if say the General Assembly were split, one body Democrat and one Republican, which was the case in 2011, and you have that comes to the General Assembly to pick up a plan of the plans that have been considered by the commission. If because of that split they don't pick a plan, it ends up going to the Supreme Court anyway. So adopting the plan that was put forth by Delegate Simon would not in effect avoid the Supreme Court ever being able to participate in this process. It would keep them there as that last arbiter on things.
George?
So I think there are a lot of reasons for doing what we have in the amendment. I hope it passes, but I guarantee you that I will work with Delegate Price and others to make sure that we improve it going forward.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Senator Barker. Excuse me.
That's all right.
I'd like to turn it over to Delegate Simon. If he's still he's got a Charlottesville background, we'll put him on and have him speak to some of these concerns, and then we'll come back to Professor Green. Delegate Simon, are you still with us?
I'm here. I'm here,
right.
and I even had time to monkey around with my background while I was listening. So, thank you to everyone for being here. You guys, I never go to Paul's church. We never get 65 people on a Saturday morning for a breakfast. So, in some ways, I think having this virtually is actually a bit of an improvement as far as our opportunities to get together. It makes it a lot easier, remove some of the barriers to everybody getting together. Although, like Delegate Price, I sort of prefer to be able to work the room a little bit ahead of time and get to know who I'm talking to. If I have one takeaway for everybody, it is that this is not a choice. There it is. Debate is being framed a lot between a vote for the amendment or going back to traditional political gerrymandering where we all do it in the back room. And I just want everybody to be really clear. I don't think anybody, certainly I'm not advocating for going back to the way we used to do things or going back to just a traditional process. What I proposed, and part of the reason I did this at the end of session to try and emphasize that particular fact for folks as we voted on SJ 18 final passage on the House side, was propose a floor substitute, which, as David explained the process, if we change anything about the constitutional amendment language the second time around after an election, it fails. So I understood that, but the tactic was to sort of emphasize to folks that this isn't a choice between going back to having the General Assembly just do it ourselves in a back room with no transparency, with the party in control, doing a Wisconsin-style closed door drawing of maps. I don't think anybody wants or advocates for that, or do we think our electorate would accept that. But the question really for me is, do we take this amendment, which Senator Barker just said we need to continue to work on improving through legislation, which every advocate of redistricting reform says has shortcomings. I would call them flaws, but some people will call them shortcomings to be generous. Whether we bake that into the Constitution. The Constitution, which still in 2020 forbids marriage between anything other than one man and one woman, right? It's still in our Constitution because the Constitution is difficult to change. We've got a long list of things that we want to get to. I want to answer some of the other issues. I guess I'm more of the tactics and strategy guy, and I know Delegate Senator Barker and Delegate Price have really covered a lot of the substance well. But from a practical point of view, voting in this constitutional amendment bakes in a lot of these shortcomings. And I guess to Delegate Price's view and to Senator Barker's, yeah, there's some things with the Voting Rights Act we can improve through legislation. There are things that we need to make sure are enshrined in the language of the Constitution. The stuff that we care most about ought to be the stuff that's hardest to change and hardest to undo before we put this in the Constitution. So I support a commission, as does I think everybody on this panel that's independent. I don't necessarily disagree with Senator Barker. Ultimately, the Senate, the Supreme Court, if nobody agrees on anything, ultimately the courts are going to be left to make us do our jobs. And if we won't do our jobs even after they tell us to, a couple of times, they'll appoint a special master and do it for us, right? And that's what we saw happen with the House maps that we all ran on in 2020 or 2019. A big 12 of those districts were redrawn by a court special master. So I get that that's how that's going to have to happen at the end of the day. So what I do for a living, just very quickly here, what I do for a living is I do real estate transactions. I'm not a professor. I haven't gone to Harvard, but I do a lot of dirt law. I do a lot of real estate stuff. And so I understand a little bit about negotiations and leverage and getting people to either agree or finding out situations where they disagree. And I think that this constitutional amendment, Senator Barker said a lot of times, the parties have to agree. It's set up so the parties have to agree. I would argue that it's set up so the parties may agree, but if somebody decides they have more leverage or have an incentive in it failing, it's really easy for either partisan group to force the commission to fail. And so that's my issue more with the Supreme Court. It's not so much that I think that the Supreme Court members themselves are going to sit there and draw gerrymandered Republican lines, but if any two Republicans and any two Democrats can scuttle the map, and they don't have the same incentives for the commission to work, then it's easy for one of them to just take a hard line and say, basically stamp their feet. So if anybody's ever been in a real estate transaction, at the end of the day, typically what makes everybody want to work together is the buyer's got a truck full of stuff sitting in the parking lot and their dog's out there and they're parked under a tree in the shade. And you got about an hour to get this all worked out because the settlement attorney's got another closing coming in and everybody wants to be done. And the seller needs the money to buy their next house. And so if this doesn't close, they don't get their money, they can't buy their next house. Everybody has to agree. So everybody sometimes swallows things they don't like. I've also seen those situations where that leverage isn't equal, it isn't balanced, right? If the seller's already bought their other house and doesn't need the money from this transaction, and they see that the buyer's got all their stuff on a truck, all of a sudden, hey, listen, I need you to fix the chimney that you said you would do. The seller says, I'm not doing it, but you have to. It says right here in the contract, you've got to fix it. Yeah, but I'm not gonna. Well, then I won't settle. Well, you got a bunch of stuff in the parking lot. I think you're going to settle. I think you're going to because the negotiations aren't balanced, right? And that gets you bad outcomes. So my concern with the Supreme Court is that given that all of these members were appointed by Republicans, given that Virginia is, if we were to draw fair maps that accurately reflect where Virginia is today, I don't think you're going to get a legislature that's got an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. I don't think you'll get a map that has more Republicans than Democrats. So what incentive do they have to draw a fair map, these two Republicans? If it reflects a Tim Kaine victory and a Mark Warner victory and Ralph Northam and Terry McAuliffe and Mark Herring twice and all these folks, right? So if it reflects Virginia, they have no incentive to agree. They might as well take their chances with the Supreme Court. So I think it's built to fail. I think it's, unfortunately, I get the supermajorities are designed to do. I think it's built to fail. I think it's more likely to kick it over to the Supreme Court. And then I would open most of this to questions. A couple more things I wanted to say, but Delegate Price covered a lot of them better than I will. The other piece is, when you voted for it in 2019, Delegate Simon, why did you vote against it in 2020? It seems to me the only thing that's different now is the Democrats control both houses. And my answer to that is I voted for it in 2019 because it was the only thing I had the option to vote for. And I'll give you guys another example. I know that Professor Green, in addition to working on redistricting, also works on felon restoration. And there's kind of a project on helping felons get their rights back. It might surprise some of the folks here to know that folks like Senator Norman and Delegate Habib, who was a Republican, were in favor of automatic restoration plans for restoring felon rights. And I even drafted a constitutional amendment in 2017, which would have allowed certain nonviolent felons to automatically have their rights restored if they met certain criteria without the governor's involvement, right? Because that's all I could hope to possibly get past a Republican legislature in 2017. I'm going to introduce a constitutional amendment in 2021 to accomplish many of the same things, but I guarantee you the language I introduced in 2021 is going to be a lot better, a lot more thorough, and a lot more comprehensive, and a lot more automatic than what I would have done in 2017 or 2018 or 2019 when Republicans controlled things. So yes, in 2019, not knowing the outcome of the election, I voted for what I thought was the best redistricting reform we could get at the time. Now that Democrats, who've always been preaching reform and have always been about doing this the right way, have always been about making sure that minorities and communities of interest are fairly represented or in charge of the redistricting process. One, I trust us to do it right with a legislative commission and a legislative process. And two, I trust us to do the amendment the right way in the future going forward. So those are sort of my big takeaways. If nothing else, this is not a choice between me and Dick Saslaw and Speaker Fillercorn in a back room drawing our maps the way we want them and the amendment. I think it's just a choice between how we're going to get reform done, and I think we can do it. I think I trust Democrats to do it the right way the first time and get an amendment that works, that we don't have to repeal and reenact in the future.
Thank you, Delegate Simon. There is a lot of information in all these presentations, and there are a lot of questions coming through the chat. I did promise Professor Green I'd circle back to her, and I'd like to ask the question to her in this way in hopes of incorporating some of the questions that are coming through in the chat. It has to do with the Voting Rights Act. The language of the proposed constitutional amendment talks about conforming where practical to all of these provisions in the United States Constitution and the Voting Rights Act, which is not a constitutional issue, but a statute, a federal statute. I guess the question is for you, how is the Voting Rights Act going to play itself out in the context of this amendment? And will it make a difference for the lines for drawing the federal districts versus the state districts? Is that too in the weeds?
No, it's not too in the weeds. And let me try to take a stab just to try to give some context to the discussion about the Voting Rights Act. And then I would like to specifically address the question of the where practicable language in the amendment. So there are two key provisions of the Voting Rights Act in protecting minority voting strength. This was, monumental when it was passed in 1965. The provisions are Section 5. They're referred to as Section 5 and Section 2. Section 5 required a certain number of jurisdictions, of states who were considered covered jurisdictions. Virginia was one of those covered jurisdictions, to pre-clear any voting change that they made, including the maps that they drew, with the federal government before they could become law. So it was essentially a mechanism that prevented states with a history of discrimination from passing laws or drawing maps that had a discriminatory impact. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 by declaring the coverage formula, deciding which states were under that provision, unconstitutional in a case called Shelby versus Holder. So we're left with Section 2. Section 2, unlike Section 5, applies nationwide. It applies everywhere. You don't have to be have a history of discrimination for it to apply. And what Section 2 does is it protects the ability of minority voters that are sufficiently compact geographically and politically cohesive to elect the candidates of their choice. If a map dilutes the ability of minority voters to elect the candidate of their choice, plaintiffs can sue under Section 2. Unlike Section 5, it doesn't kick in until after the harm emerges through the map drawing process. It doesn't prevent a map from being drawn in the first place, but it provides a mechanism for people to address things after the fact. Like Section 5, Section 2 is also on the Supreme Court's chopping block. Why? Because as Justice Thomas laid out in a concurrence in a case called Holder versus Hull, the preference of conservatives is that no community, including racial minorities, be provided a helping hand by federal law. This is a version of the argument against affirmative action, right? The law should be colorblind, which, if anyone's been reading books like that many of us have been reading since the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests have erupted. Of course, the idea of colorblindness is problematic if you're concerned about structural racism. So it's hard to say whether the court will strike Section 2 or not, and it's equally hard to say what the parameters of that decision would look like. There's no Section 2 vote dilution case currently pending before the court, so that it's a guessing game essentially in terms of how the court would strike it. But what I think is important to recognize is that if the Supreme Court does strike the federal Section 2 language, Virginia, under this amendment, will be one of the few states that retains protection for minority voters explicitly in its constitution. And that is huge. Depending on how the court strikes it, this protection that we have in our constitution could likewise be unconstitutional according to that ruling. But it's also possible that it could strike it in a way that we're able to retain our constitutional protection, that the language that was in the Voting Rights Act originally, but that now would be contained in the Constitution of Virginia.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
For a second, just to make sure people, are you saying that protection would be built into this amendment, or is there another clause in the Virginia Constitution?
It is in this amendment. The ability of minorities to elect the candidate of their choice is written into this amendment. It would be in the Virginia Constitution. Now there is a comma where practicable language in there. So let's talk about the where practicable language. This might seem like a big loophole. I think someone in the chat referred to this as, oh dear, no, I can't find it. It's always hard to read the chat while you're talking, but people are worried that this is a big loophole, that where practicable essentially, cuts the legs out from underneath this protection. And I want to emphasize that, in fact, where practicable is actually what the law requires. In other words, courts would require that racial protections for racial minorities not predominate over every other consideration, like the traditional redistricting criteria, for example, anyway. So it's not that that language does something that the law doesn't already require. And let me be very clear, the reason why two maps, the congressional and House maps, were overturned by a court as racial gerrymanders is because race predominated in the calculus of where they drew the lines. And that is not, according to Supreme Court precedent, that is not allowed under the Constitution. That's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So essentially, the amendment's text makes this requirement concrete. In other words, you can't elevate racial considerations over traditional redistricting criteria. But what is in there is something that no or very few other states have, which is the requirement that you can't leave your concern for cohesive minority communities to be able to elect the candidate of their choice off the table. There is a constitutional mandate in this amendment that requires it. And so if it does disappear at the federal level, I think minorities in Virginia have greater protection because it's in the Virginia Constitution, assuming this passes. So I hope that explained a little bit about sort of how the voting rights operates and what's at stake here. It's very complicated, and there's a lot of unknown in terms of what the Supreme Court's going to do. But I hope that helps.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. And so the one person who sent in a question, I think, is really to be addressed to Delegate Simon and Delegate Price. It says here, what do I tell my friends and others when they say that Democrats are being hypocritical now that they are not supporting the amendment? And they say, that's a serious question. I can come up with a snarky answer, but I'd rather have a more substantive answer. And I asked Delegate Price, Delegate Simon, to see if they could comment on this. I might just say one thing. I was in the General Assembly when the first version of the constitutional amendment was passed. And I remember very distinctly, and I think Senator Barker, Delegate Price, and Delegate Simon will remember it too. This thing just came at us at the very last minute of that 2019 session. All of a sudden, I think it was like the last day or last 2 days, we are presented with this proposed amendment that came out of the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, Senator Barker. I don't know how it got developed. I guess Republicans came to Democrats and said, well, can we agree on something? And then it kind of popped into the process. So there wasn't a lot of time to really look at this thing when we saw it. And then a lot of us voted for the constitutional amendment, and some people are having a lot of second thoughts. So that's the question for my friends, Delegate Price and Delegate Simon. What do you say to those anybody who says that Democrats are being hypocritical now?
So I want to first to put out there that there has been a concerted effort for redistricting reform for years. So I want to clarify that you weren't saying that the redistricting amendment happened at the last minute, but the version that we have before us is what happened. So
precisely.
Yeah. One Virginia 2020, and I met the organization when they were still fighting for the original independent commission, and came to CNU, had a movie and everything, and had the funny drawn lines and all of that. So the push for redistricting reform has been ongoing. What we still call you Delegate. So Delegate Toscano was saying was, when we were sitting in our chairs, what happened was the Senate had the version that I guess Senator Barker had. Well, on the House side, it was Republican Mark Cole. And so if you have, of course, as we were in a couple of other situations, when you have two different versions, a House version and a Senate version that are not exactly the same, it goes into conference. That is the group that I was saying. There were no people of color at the table to even be a part of the conversation. And one woman, Jill Vogel. So I'm not trying to be funny. I love my brother, Paul Kresak, but he was the newest member to P&E. He was put there, by a Republican House Speaker, and that's miraculously who they chose to go into this contentious conversation to get to the last stop. So it was very quick to come at us, and this version. So maybe 6 or 7 members of the Black Caucus get up to speak against it. And I would say this to his face, so I'm not talking behind his back, but even my brother, Mark Sickles, did not have to listen to me in 2019. But what flipped was, elections have consequences, and now Democrats have the majority, and the ears change. Everything that I'm saying today is the exact same thing that I said in 2019. But now I'm, third or fourth in line on P&E. Apparently reporters know how to find me now. So it was like I didn't have an amplified voice. So now you have to hear it every day. I am telling you the same thing every day, and I'm making you answer my question. So whether you like me or not, if you can't answer my question as to in 2041, how do we make sure that there is racial diversity of the commission? And you tell me a piece of legislation that Republicans can tear down the first moment that they get power. If you can't answer my questions, then the conversation continues. And that is what some of us did. We beat the drum every single day, and people started listening. And when they did not have answers to our questions, it was apparent, maybe we should have conversations. I have zero doubt in my mind that if we had not won the election, that my almost freshman self, because I still get treated like a freshman sometimes in my 5th year, but my young self would not have been invited to such an esteemed table as where I found myself when we were working with Senator Barker. You guys in the Senate, y'all, I love y'all, but y'all are ageist sometimes. And I felt like I was getting patted on my head, and it was like, oh, but some people didn't know about my resume prior to getting to the House. I've been working on redistricting since high school. And so, I may not have a PhD, I get that, but I have lived experience of being a disenfranchised voter. You know, so I'm bringing a lot to the table that I think people were able to listen to. The last thing I'll say, if you could just indulge me for 1 second, compromises automatically make things different. And the existence of a compromise for a legislator makes things different, the commission. So I'm not talking about the fact that some of the power is taken away from legislators. That's not what I'm talking about. But here, this amendment demands Democrats to be more in a compromising position than just a compromise, by the fact that, and I'll still keep saying it, Gilbert and Bell or Norman and Stanley or whoever, and they for 20 years have shut out conversations about, you know, redistricting, including the summer before this vote, when Delegate Toscano, the fearless leader he was trying to get us to fair maps through legislation. The entire Republican side was like, no, 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 it's our job, this, never a commission. Then they got the poll results about what the elections were about to look like, and they knew they were about to lose, and they knew, okay, we got to get something in this to protect ourselves. This compromise is Republican protection, period. And I just think for this session, under our first woman speaker ever, any bill that we have passed that has been anything towards equity or equality for people of color, for women, for the LGBTQIA community, if you look at their press releases, they are receiving equity and equality as punishment. Any of their privilege that gets taken away is punishment. So I just do not understand how we cannot see that two of them could come together and not want to be punished by a fair process. And it's just mind-boggling. These people have told you who they are for 20 years. And I wish that we would believe them.
One thing we have to say for Delegate Price, if she's nothing else, she is certainly transparent.
That is true.
Senator Barker, can I go to you and sort of follow up on this question? Because
Sure.
I mean, I assume that people come to you and you would never use the word hypocritical to describe any of your colleagues. I know that, but is that issue sort of resonating with some folks in your community, or saying, I don't understand why the Democrats are doing this? For years, they've supported a nonpartisan approach, and now they're trying to back away. Are you hearing that from your constituents?
I do hear that some. There is no question about that. So there is some of that sentiment out there that just because we took over the majority, suddenly, you know, we're not so enthralled with what we had been pushing for years. So it is a significant issue. And just to go back to the situation in 2019, I mean, I've been working this issue for years. So I've had different constitutional amendments, different legislative proposals to try to address the issue of a commission. Most went nowhere in the end, particularly during the years when some of the Republicans had majority in the Senate. But by the time we got to 2019, they were willing to work with us. And actually, Senator Bogle had some of the bills that had passed in the Senate previously. It's unfortunate that the House Democrats, by and large, were not involved in this issue. And we had everybody in the Senate involved, and we passed in the Senate, overwhelming support from both Democrats and Republicans. It passed in the Senate by 40-0 and 39-1 votes. So it was something that we had been collectively working on for several years. And part of what had happened in the House was that, but with Delegate Cole, he had sort of frozen out the House Democrats in terms of this type of thing, and had never really engaged seriously in working on things. This is not actually a significant compromise from what we passed in the Senate in 2019, in that in the conference committee, we made very little in the way of substantive changes to the bill. And actually, I was able to get a couple things in that a couple of the House Democrats came to me on and suggested. So it really is by and large a Democratic bill that was negotiated with the Republicans in the Senate, and who ended up, across the board supporting it there. And it, because of the nature of how we do things in the legislature, if you're not involved on your side in dealing with something, you sometimes get surprised a little bit. And it's a new thing when it comes from to a final conference report on things. There was a Delegate Sickles did offer a substitute which I think all the Democrats voted for, but it went down because it was a party line vote when Delegate Cole's bill had first been generated over there.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. And I do think it points out some of the dynamic that goes on in the General Assembly session. Two bodies can sometimes not know anything about what the other body is doing until the very last minute. Even though we're Democrats, sometimes there are disagreements even within the bodies about stuff. So that's sort of the internal politics. I want to make sure that people understand and emphasize Delegate Price's point. While the language of the 2019 resolution was not presented until the very last minute, it is true that redistricting reform has been on the agenda for a long, long time. I remember, in 2000, George had early bills. I know Senator Deeds had one of the early bills that got passed out of the Senate. I had several bills that had nonpartisan redistricting as early as 2007 or 8. We're talking a long time. It's not like this thing got invented overnight. It has gone through many machinations. There have been very different plans over the years. So it's been a long time in coming. Marcus, do you want to
so real quickly,
the hypocrisy issue right now?
Yeah, real quickly on that for a couple of things. One, that's not a substantive question. I don't think. I think it's it's a political question. And I see in the chat that somebody says this has got 70% popularity. I would say that if you're willing to vote for Republicans who are against all the things that Delegate Price just said they voted against because you don't like the way the Democrats wanted to go with a legislative versus a constitutional fix to redistricting reform, I don't know that that's a deciding factor for any real Democrats. I think it's going to cost us seats or cost us politically. And particularly when we follow through in 2021. We have an opportunity to prove it before our next election by actually doing the redistricting, by passing the legislative fixes, by accepting the recommendations of the commission, even though we don't have to, and drawing fair maps. People will see the product before the next election. So in fact, there's a lot of pressure that would shift to the Democrats to deliver. If we reject the amendment, we've got a lot of political pressure to deliver on fair maps and the promise of fair maps. I think we have a better chance of getting them legislatively. Two, on the process piece in 2019, this is exactly the question that caused many of us that aren't quite as principled, I guess, as Delegate Price, I don't know that way, but many of us to vote for it was, look, we had a lot of options. And yes, Senator Barker's didn't get changed a whole lot in conference. We didn't know which option was going to land on our desk to vote on of all the different things that were floating around out there on a day when, as you point out, a lot happens that we don't know about because usually around crossover time or at the deadline to get all our amendments, those are days when we hear, I'm not kidding, 300 bills, right, in a day in a legislative floor session. This is the redistricting reform thing. Do I like it? Do I not like it? Some people don't like it. Some people don't like it. Well, can I vote against it? I got an election coming up. This is I don't want to be painted as being anti-reform, and we get another shot at it next year. This isn't final passage of this language. This keeps the process moving forward. So that's how I explain what happened in 2019. And not knowing the outcome, it may have been the best we could do. Now we can do better. Now we're in charge. Now we have an opportunity to prove it's not a power move. We have an opportunity to actually deliver on fair maps.
So, Mark, Delegate Simon, can I follow up with you on this? Because I think one of the things that some people with One Virginia 2021 or people who support the amendment might say is, we don't know what happens if this thing fails, that it's better to have something than nothing. So can you give us some insight into what you think Delegate Price, the other Democrats who support redistricting reform will likely do in the next session if this amendment fails? And then maybe Senator Barker can give us his perspective of what is likely to happen. And of course, we'll give the professor the ability to comment about whether such things are constitutional or create problems in terms of what we want to do with transparency and fair maps.
Sure.
So,
well, thank you for that, because that gives me an opportunity to revisit the issue of the enabling legislation in the conference report and why it failed. So I think what was inserted into the conference report that hadn't been there before, which I think fairly or not, it was caused Senator Barker to object because it was something new added at the end, was the what happens if the amendment fails language. And so what I think would happen is basically, if you want to look it up, the language is mostly borrowed from House Bill 1256 of Delegate Price's, which passed the House but failed to pass in the Senate. But we would set up, well, so we have had it passed. Right now, we'd actually be having a commission that would have been formed, a citizens commission that would have been formed. It would start having public input now, right? We'd be able to have public input starting this fall. So I know the amendment talks about having 3 public hearings in different parts of the state. We'd have an ongoing rolling public process. We'd go all over the state. We would start that process well before the census data comes in, well before our legislative session starts so that everybody can participate. But absent that, we will start a public input process for a fully citizen commission that would be made up, that would represent, and this is the important, one of the important distinctions, that would be made up to represent a fair cross-section of Virginia, not just politically, so not just an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, but urban and rural, communities of color, communities of interest, all sorts of folks. And we'd have a fairly large commission to make sure that all those folks have a seat at the table, opportunity to be heard. They would have yes, it'd be advisory, because without a constitutional amendment, this is the reason this needs to be done at some point through the Constitution is the Constitution right now says the General Assembly shall establish legislative districts, right? That's what it says. And we can't delegate that completely to somebody else without taking that line out of the Constitution. That said, once it comes to, and that's part of the reason my substitute, Senator Barker's very earlier point, came back to the General Assembly, because the Constitution still says it's got to. But I think there'd be enormous political pressure for us not to ignore this commission that just received all this public input that we set up for the purpose of drawing these districts for us. Just ignore their work wouldn't be politically feasible or practical. It wouldn't happen. And then we would, I see George, but then we would take that process that we established, and we've got the language for it that was in our substitute or conference report as well. And then we would turn that into constitutional amendment language on first reference in 2021. It would then have an election, then we'd then, pass in 2022 and put on the 2022 ballot.
Okay, Senator Barker, and then we'll ask if Delegate Price wants to build on Delegate Simon, then we'll go to the professor.
Well, just a couple of different things. One is that there is a provision in the U.S. Constitution that talks about the state legislatures drawing the congressional maps. It would not have anything to do with state legislative districts, but with the congressional districts. That was challenged. It failed with, I think it was Kennedy who voted with the 4 more Democratic Supreme Court justices on a 5-4 vote. But my understanding is that Chief Justice Roberts has made it pretty clear that he believes that these citizen-only commissions, or commissions such as in Delegate Simon's substitute that had been proposed, that could be able to adopt something without it ever going to the legislature, would violate that. So I'm concerned that if we went to that type of process, we could have it thrown out by the Supreme Court. That would have some impact there. As it relates to the situation, if the amendment fails in November, then we will have to move very fast. We are one of only 2 states in the nation that has state legislative elections scheduled for November 2021. It's us in New Jersey. Sometimes Mississippi and Louisiana have that, but in this cycle, they're not up at this time. What it means is we have to get the redistricting done fast, and we may not get the redistricting done, period, regardless of whether it's done through the General Assembly or through a commission, if the census data is not prompt. And right now, the Census Bureau, the Trump administration, has asked to extend the deadline to end of July. We could not take something the end of July and be able to have maps that could be used for elections in November and go through both a primary and a general election process there. So we are always under a significant pressure. We did, however, in 2011, basically pass a bill that had maps for both the House of Delegates and the state Senate in them. That was then vetoed by the governor because He did not like the Senate map and did not have support of any of the Republicans in the Senate on that. We went back and revised it to address some of the concerns at issue. It did cost us 1 seat, but we held on to pretty much everything else that was important in that map. And then we had to do pre-clearance at the time because that was before the Supreme Court had taken care of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And we're still able to get it done in time that we had primary elections on August 23rd and the general election in November. But there are some real challenges here, and I think it would be very difficult to get it done if we don't get the census data in time. If we do, then we can move as quickly as we can. Whether we can get an advisory commission, which would be all that we could do through a statute here, up and running in time, that could be done. But we're already a little bit at odds as to how I think we should how that commission should be. A commission should be who should be sitting on a commission and how it would operate. So I'm not sure whether we could get that done or whether it would just be the straight political process that would end up governing things.
Thank you. I think you guys are going to be under pressure no matter what, because you're still going to have a criteria bill, some kind of enactment bill, even if it does pass, and you still got to get the numbers. And who knows with the census how messed up that is, what that's going to do to us. Delegate Price, do you have anything to build on what Delegate Simon said?
Yeah, I just want to be very clear that any of the legislative fixes that we have proposed, whether it be House Bill 1256 or the conference report, any of that, the legislative fix was to get us through 2021 at an attempt to get to a better constitutional amendment. I don't want what Delegate Simon said to go unheard. When opposition is being brought up to the legislative fix, it talks about for when the power changes. That is to get us to the ability to get a more complete and better amendment. We're not looking at that as a fail-safe for perpetuity. But I really want to push back on the timing issue. If the commission were to pass at the referendum, you don't get to start working on that until the day after it passes anyway. So even if we had a special session the next day to get the enabling legislation in place, there's not pre-work being done on this until it passes anyway. So we would be under the gun. I think what our delegate Toscano was saying, whether it's the census information, whether it's the legislative fix, or whether we could come that next week to pass, whether it's enabling legislation if the thing should pass, or if it fails, the legislative fix to get us through the 2021 drawing process. So I don't see the time frame issue as really being for or against, but this idea of like the moral argument being such that Democrats have to keep their word, I think leaving behind voters of color or legislators of color, people of color on the commission, I think that's a moral argument as well. I think giving away more of our power than what is, in order for us to call it fair, I think that is a moral issue. This other piece that I just want to go back to that, Senator Barker mentioned. Senator Barker said something that was very interesting that I think I wholeheartedly disagree with, but that is that legislators bring more knowledge to the table about some of these things. If that were true, then I'm having trouble reconciling the fact that 11 districts were thrown out, a congressional district was thrown out as racial gerrymanders with legislators at the table. 38 of the people that were at the table that drew those districts are still in the legislature today and would be able to be appointed to this new commission, and including 4, and this is two Democrats, 2 Republicans, that would be choosing the legislators for them to go to this commission. And so I just want to really understand. I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. I was in the back rooms. I want to be very clear. Delegate Toscano told y'all I'm very transparent. That was some of the scariest moments of my life. It was sitting around the table with nothing but golems. And whether I felt like I was the best person to be elected for the 95th district because I'm going to fight for freedom and justice and fairness, or whether I wanted to come back to this table because I need the check that I get, or I want to come back to this table because I have amassed so much power over 10 years and I could be a chair, Whatever the reason is that gets that legislator to the table, we cannot separate ourselves from our own benefit. It just will not happen. And the fact that if we pass this, we are baking self-interested people into a fair map-making process is problematic. I think we have brilliant Virginians from across the Commonwealth that could be a diverse group of people that have not taken seminars on how to gerrymander and get away with it, that could draw fair maps. And so I just want to push back on that. And I think that's what is the impetus behind the legislative process, trying to get those voices at the forefront as opposed to self-interest.
Okay, the cardinal rule of politics is decisions are made by those people in the room at the time, right? Well, Professor Green, do you have any comments about the legal issues surrounding what happens if this doesn't pass?
Yeah, I just want to, I just want to point out, just as a point of information for everyone to be aware of, that if Virginia passes this redistricting reform, it will be historic, because it will be the first and only, as far as I'm aware. I think there may be some other examples in history, but in the modern era, it will be the first time that a legislature votes twice to take its own power away. And that every time another state has established an independent redistricting commission that I think everyone agrees is the gold standard, that has been done directly by the people, because those states have the ability for the people to pass laws directly. They don't have to pass through the state legislature twice like you do in Virginia. So I think that is a big reason why legislators are on this commission that the amendment contemplates. And that is because there was no way that we were going to get it through to separate legislatures without leaving legislators at the table. So it's a compromise. It is the best Virginia can do. Is it perfect? No, but many people believe that it is a step forward. Someone was asking in the chat about a mid-decade redistrict, and I thought I would just really quickly explain power changes sometimes during the decade. And so in several states, when the power has shifted, legislators have tried to redraw maps. This happened sort of most famously in Texas in a case called LULAC. And the plaintiffs in that case sued and said, this is a partisan gerrymander. They just came in and changed the maps mid-decade, and mid-decade redistricts should be considered illegal partisan gerrymanders. Unfortunately, Justice Kennedy did not agree. And so mid-decade redistricting is constitutional. Of course, now there's no such thing as a partisan gerrymandering claim at the federal level anyway. But as I understand it, Virginia's constitution currently says that the legislature shall redistrict, and that term "shall" doesn't necessarily constrain a mid-decade redistrict currently under the current statute, under the current constitution. Just to clarify that point.
And it is true. We have seen a number of Republican bills over the years that would do fundamental redistricting as opposed to technical adjustments. And the Democrats have always opposed them. And I think the governor might have even, well, we've always opposed them. All right, let's see here. Well, we're at the 11 o'clock hour, and I'm trying to see if there's anything in these chat questions that I want to draw your attention to. So Professor Green, the way this works is if there is a challenge to a redistricting plan, it has to be brought by people who live in a district. It can't be brought by legislators, right?
I would not, so you can't challenge, correct, you cannot challenge the map as a sitting legislature, although I would never want to say never because people are really creative. Okay. So I think that's correct.
Okay. Well, at this point, I guess, Stephen, we're at the 11 o'clock hour, and I think the folks on this call have done a terrific job of trying to illuminate the challenges in thinking through this. This is not an easy process, and I hope that whatever side people end up on, they'll recognize that Democrats have struggled mightily to figure this out. And there are going to be really progressive Democrats who support the amendment and really progressive Democrats who oppose the amendment. And I know that some people's mailboxes have been filled with vitriol for one reason or another, and it's probably not, it's not justified, because we are trying to struggle with what's the best thing here. Stephen, do you have anything more to add before we wrap this up?
No,
Other than to thank our really learned panel.
No, I just thank you to the panel. Thank you to David Toscano for moderating with us today. You know, there are a lot of issues kind of wrapped up in all of this, and like all decisions that we make, you know, it's a matter of kind of which values we prioritize, right? And I think, you know, thinking about that, and the General Assembly has made its decision, has put this to the voters. So now it's on all of us to, you know, make our decision in November and decide whether, you know, we want this in the Constitution or if we want another approach. And so, you know, our goal this morning was to kind of give people a little bit of the background, because I think at least in the Charlottesville area, there's been a lot of organizing around reform over the years, but now it's coming to voters, and we wanted to make sure folks heard kind of as many of the ins and outs as possible as we could. So hope you got a taste of that today. We did record this, and we also, you know, will save the chat comments and so forth to kind of share. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panel for taking your Saturday morning. You know, I'm sorry you couldn't drive down to Charlottesville and enjoy a vineyard or brewery after the fact, but hopefully you'll be able to do that at some point in the future. And if anyone has additional questions, feel free to put my email for the party in the chat box. I'm happy to kind of put you in touch with any of our panelists if you need it for kind of future questions or engagement. But thank you all for being here. Don't forget to get out and help volunteer on the elections, you know, coming up, the coordinated campaign, Dr. Webb's campaign for Congress, all need your help. So please get involved if you're not already, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you.